I made a mistake. That's the only way I know how to start this. Because if I'm being honest with myself, really honest, the kind of honest you can only be at 64 when there's no one left to perform, for I raised my son to believe that money was love. Not on purpose. Never on purpose. But I worked 80-hour weeks while he grew up. I missed baseball games and science fairs, and the night he got his heart broken for the first time by a girl named Katie Marsh in the 9th grade. I wasn't there. But the credit card was. The tuition check was. The brand new car sitting in the driveway on his 18th birthday was. So when my son called me on a Tuesday morning in March and told me he was getting married and that I was not invited to the wedding, I probably should not have been as surprised as I was. But when a certified letter arrived at my door 11 days later, with a bill for $427,000, I sat down on my porch steps and I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't know what else to do. Let me back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I am 64 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio that I paid off 17 years ago. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. I was not a perfect father. I was not a perfect husband. My wife, Carol, passed away 8 years ago from an illness that moved fast and gave us very little time to say the things we should have said years earlier. My son, I'll call him my son, because that's what he is. Whatever else he might be was 26 when his mother died. I watched him grieve. I held him while he cried at the funeral. I thought, in some naive way, that loss had made us closer. His name is Derek. He's 34 now. Derek met a woman named Amber 2 years after Carol passed. I tried to like Amber. I want to be fair here, because this is my account of events, and I am aware that I am not a neutral party. But I tried. I invited her to Thanksgiving. I asked her questions about her life, her work, her family. She was a lifestyle content creator, that's what she called herself, with about 40,000 followers on Instagram. She had a way of looking at a room like she was calculating its value, and a way of looking at me like I was part of the furniture. Derek had always been generous with information about money when it suited him. So I knew, because he told me, that Amber's brand was not exactly thriving. He mentioned, casually, over lunch one afternoon, that she had gotten into some trouble with a lease on an apartment she'd shared with a business partner. He mentioned even more casually that there had been a legal dispute. He never mentioned the details. I didn't push. What I didn't know, what I would only find out much later, was that by the time Derek called me in March to announce his engagement and his decision to exclude me from the ceremony, Amber had a civil judgment against her name for unpaid rent, totaling $68,000. She had a credit card debt in collections. And she had, at some point in the previous year, purchased followers for her Instagram account in bulk, something a woman from her old management company would later tell me with the exhausted tone of someone who had seen it happen too many times. But I didn't know any of that when Derek called. What I knew was the sound of his voice. Flat, rehearsed, like he had written it down and practiced it in the mirror. "Dad," he said, "Amber and I have decided that we want our wedding to be an intimate experience, close friends only. We've thought a lot about it, and we feel that your presence would create tension that we're not willing to have on our wedding day." I was quiet for a moment. "Tension," I said. "You've never really accepted Amber." "Derek, I've had her at my house for every holiday for 2 years. Physically being somewhere isn't the same as accepting someone." He said it like he'd read it somewhere. He probably had. I asked if there was something specific I had done. He said it wasn't about one thing. I asked if we could talk in person. He said he didn't think that would be productive right now. I asked if he was sure about this decision. He said yes. We said goodbye. I sat in my kitchen for a long time afterward with a cup of coffee that went cold. I am not going to pretend I handled the next few days with grace. I didn't sleep well. I called my brother in Pittsburgh and talked for 2 hours. I went through the motions of my day's grocery store, evening walk, the Wednesday poker game with 3 men I've known for 20 years, and I felt like I was doing it all from inside a glass box, watching myself go through the motions of a life. The certified letter came on a Friday. I signed for it at the door, brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and made myself finish my breakfast before I opened it. I don't know why. Some instinct that told me whatever was in that envelope deserved to be received on a full stomach. The letter was 4 pages long. It was written on what appeared to be a template purchased from the internet, dressed up with formal language that didn't quite hang right, the way an expensive suit looks wrong on someone who has never worn one. The gist of it was this: Derek and Amber had planned a wedding. The total cost of the wedding, the reception, and the honeymoon to a private resort in the Maldives came to $427,000. The letter argued, and I use that word loosely, that as Derek's father, as the patriarch of the family, and as someone who had consistently represented financial support as a form of parental love, I had created a reasonable expectation that I would fund significant life milestones. The wedding, it continued, was such a milestone. My failure to offer financial support proactively was characterized as a breach of that expectation. The letter concluded with a request, not quite a demand, but not quite a request either, for payment within 30 days. At the bottom, in Derek's handwriting, someone had added a single line: "Dad, you should be grateful we're even giving you the chance to be part of this." I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it neatly, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the drawer of my desk where I keep documents that matter. Then I called my brother again. "Send it to a lawyer," he said, before I had finished explaining. "It's not legally enforceable," I said. "I know. Send it anyway." I did. My attorney, a woman named Patricia, who has handled my affairs for 12 years and has the energy of someone who has seen everything and is no longer impressed by any of it, called me the following Monday. She confirmed what I already suspected. The letter had no legal standing. I owed nothing. She also said something that stayed with me. "The interesting question," she said, "isn't whether you owe them money. It's what they're planning to do when you don't pay." I had been asking myself the same thing. Here is what I knew about the wedding. It was scheduled for the second Saturday in May. I knew the venue, a vineyard and event space about 40 minutes outside the city, because Derek had mentioned it 6 months earlier, back when things were different, back when I had naively assumed I would be attending. I knew the approximate guest count was around 80 people. I knew that Amber's parents lived in Florida, and that her father was, as Derek had once described him, not really in a financial position to help with big things. What I did not know, and what I spent the next several weeks finding out, was the full picture of what was happening. A man I'll call an old colleague, someone who had worked adjacent to the financial industry for many years and owed me a favor from a business matter in 2019, made some discreet inquiries. What came back was illuminating. The vineyard venue required a 50% deposit to hold the date. That deposit, roughly $60,000, based on what the total would later be invoiced for, had been put on a credit card. Not Derek's card. A card that had been opened 6 months prior in a name that was not quite Amber's legal name, but was close enough to cause confusion. The honeymoon had been booked through a luxury travel agency. The deposit there was $30,000, placed on a different card. Derek's own financial position, I learned, was less stable than I had believed. He had a good job. He was a project manager at a mid-sized tech company, but he had also, in the previous 18 months, taken out a personal loan for $40,000. The stated purpose on the application was home improvement. He rented an apartment. I sat with all of this for several days. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I felt, because it would be easy to perform an emotion that plays well. Rage, betrayal, the righteous anger of a father wronged. I felt those things, yes. But underneath all of it was something quieter and more uncomfortable. Something that sounded, if I listened to it honestly, a lot like grief. Because Derek was not a bad child. He was my child. I remembered the version of him that used to fall asleep on the couch with his head on my shoulder watching football. The version that called me from college when he was overwhelmed and just needed to hear a familiar voice. The version that stood next to me at Carol's graveside and held my hand and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. That version of Derek was real. He had existed. And somewhere along the way, through choices I had made and choices he had made and possibly choices that woman had made for both of them, he had become someone who could send his father a bill for $427,000 and call it gratitude. I did not pay the bill. I also did not send a response. Not immediately. What I did instead was make a series of phone calls and take a series of meetings over the course of about 3 weeks. I met with Patricia twice more. I met with my financial advisor, a steady man named Gerald, who has managed my retirement accounts for 11 years, and who responded to the situation with the exact calm I needed. I made some adjustments to certain documents that were entirely within my legal rights to make. I had been meaning to update my estate plan since Carol died, and I simply finally got around to doing it. I also had a conversation with my brother's daughter, my niece, Rebecca, who is 31 and sharp and has always had a good relationship with Derek. I asked her carefully whether she had any sense of what was going on with him. She was quiet for a long moment. "Uncle Richard," she said. "I'll let that name stand. I think he's in over his head, and he doesn't know how to ask for help in a way that isn't controlling. Do you think he loves her?" Another pause. "I think he loves who he thought she was." I thanked her. I thought about that for a long time. The second Saturday in May arrived. I spent it the way I have spent many Saturdays since Carol died. A long morning walk, coffee on the porch, an afternoon with a book I had been meaning to read for months. The weather was good. A neighbor's dog wandered into my yard and let me scratch its ears for a few minutes before trotting home. It was a quiet day. It was, in the specific way that quiet days can be, when you know something large is happening somewhere without you. One of the harder days I have had in recent memory. I did not attend the wedding. I was not invited, and I did not invite myself. On the Monday after the wedding, Derek called me. His voice was different this time, less rehearsed, more tired. "The venue is asking about the balance," he said. "I see." The final payment was supposed to be made before the event. "Derek," I said, "I received a letter asking me to contribute to your wedding. I did not agree to contribute to your wedding. I don't believe there was ever a conversation in which I made that commitment." A long silence. "You always said you'd support me. I have supported you. I paid for your college education. I helped you with your first car. When you had that situation with your apartment 4 years ago, I covered 3 months of rent without saying a word about it to anyone. I have supported you your entire life, and I will always love you. But I did not agree to fund a wedding that I was not invited to attend. So you're not going to help. I'm not going to pay a bill I didn't agree to." He hung up. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more calls from Derek, from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Amber, and from a man who identified himself as representing the venue, though Patricia later confirmed he had no legal authority to collect anything from me whatsoever. I let Patricia handle the last one. I kept the conversations with Derek short and calm. I told him I loved him. I told him I was not paying. I told him that when he was ready to have a real conversation, I was here. Amber called me once. It was a Sunday evening. She spoke for about 4 minutes without pausing, covering a range of topics that included my failures as a father, the allegedly symbolic meaning of money in family relationships, and her view that my behavior was a form of emotional abuse. I listened to all of it. When she was finished, I said, "Amber, I hope the two of you find a path forward that works for you." And I ended the call. Patricia sent a formal response to the original letter, on letterhead, stating clearly and without embellishment that I had no legal obligation arising from the correspondence, that any further contact from third parties claiming to represent a collection interest would be handled exclusively through her office, and that I wished Derek and Amber well in their marriage. The venue eventually worked out a payment plan with Derek directly. The honeymoon travel agency, I later understood, was less accommodating. I did not ask for details. In June, I received a message from Rebecca. She had had coffee with Derek. She said he seemed tired and a little lost. She said he had asked about me. I called him. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. We talked for almost an hour. It was not an easy conversation. There were long silences and a few moments where one of both of us said things that landed hard. But it was a real conversation, the first one we had managed in a long time. He did not apologize for the letter, not directly, not in those words. But at one point he said, "I think I've made some choices lately that I'm going to have to think about." And that was enough for me to keep the door open. I'm not going to tell you that everything is resolved, because it isn't. I'm not going to tell you that Derek and I are back to where we were before, because I'm not sure where we were before was as solid as I thought it was. What I can tell you is this. I did not pay $427,000. I did not allow a letter to redefine what I owed my son or what love looks like between a parent and a grown child. I updated my estate plan, made sure my own future was protected, and I kept the door open without walking through it on someone else's terms. There is a version of this story where I write the check, where I tell myself it's worth it for the relationship. where I swallow the humiliation of that letter and that phone call and that handwritten line about being grateful for the opportunity to contribute, and I pay for a wedding I wasn't allowed to attend, and I smile and pretend that was love. I am not that version of me anymore. I sat on my porch last week as the sun went down over the same street I've lived on for 22 years, and I thought about Carol, and about the father I had been when Derek was small, and about the father I had tried to become after she died, and about the father I was still figuring out how to be now. I thought about what it means to love someone when that love is not being received the way you intended. And I thought about that morning in March, when I sat in my kitchen with a cup of cold coffee after the phone call, and I felt like the ground had shifted under everything I thought I had built. The ground shifted, but I did not fall. I'm still here, older and somewhat wiser, and considerably more clear-eyed about what I will and will not accept, from my son or from anyone else. I have a good life. I have my brother and Rebecca and Gerald and Patricia, and 3 men I've known for 20 years who expect me at the poker table on Wednesday nights. I have a porch and a paid-off house and a dog that occasionally wanders into my yard and accepts a few minutes of affection before going home. I have time, still, to get some things right. And if my son decides he wants to be part of that time, the real version of him, not the one who signs his name to letters like that, the door is open. It always will be. That's what it means to be a father. Not the check. Not the $427,000. Not the performance of generosity that gets mistaken for love. Just the door. Always open. Even when everything else has changed.